All right. Well, welcome everyone. Glad to see you again this evening. Tonight's program on the Delaware Voting Rights Coalition and work underway to expand access to the ballot box and make more steps toward a more perfect union, particularly as it relates to voting, a key issue across the country and certainly in Delaware. So let me turn it over to Dick Jolly, who's spearheading tonight's program. Dick?
Well, thank you, Sue, and thank you, Dwayne, for joining us. We are delighted to have you this evening and look forward to your presentation. For those of you that do not know, Dwayne is with the ACLU of Delaware. He is staff attorney. He joined the ACLU in that role in 2020 after serving for 3 years with the U.S. Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights and 2 years with the U.S. Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division. He's a graduate of the University of Pennsylvania Law School, began his career with a law firm in Washington, D.C. And prior to law school, Dwayne was selected as a Truman Scholar in 2006 and taught middle school science and social studies in Philadelphia Public Schools as a Teach for America Corps member. So Dwayne, again, we are delighted to have you with us this evening, and I'll let you take it from here.
All right, well, thank you so much for the invitation, and thank you all for spending your Thursday evening with me on this important subject of voting rights here in Delaware. I know Delaware hasn't been getting all of the headlines necessarily when it comes to voting rights, but there really are some important developments happening in the state of Delaware and some necessary changes to help increase access to the ballot. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, introduce you all to the Delaware Voting Rights Coalition. Can someone just confirm for me that you can see the slideshow?
Yes, we can.
Awesome. So this is our brand new logo. We're really proud of our new logo as the Delaware Voting Rights Coalition. It's a coalition that has been spearheaded by the ACLU of Delaware, but has really grown quite a bit in the last just over a year. This is just going to be a voting rights advocacy overview. I borrowed from a slide deck that we had for an Advocacy Day training that we did with some of our coalition partners on targeted representatives. So tonight we'll talk about what the Delaware Voting Rights Coalition is. I'll talk a little bit about HB 75, the constitutional amendment. We'll talk about vote by mail more generally, and then we'll talk about same-day registration, which is HB 25. So first, the Delaware Voting Rights Coalition. It might be new to you. You maybe haven't heard of the Delaware Voting Rights Coalition before. It is Delaware's first statewide coalition of voting rights organizations and advocates. We're working with policymakers and other organizational leaders to consider reforms that will improve access to the ballot. Our focus is empowering communities, especially communities of color, people who speak English as a second language, people involved in the criminal justice system, young folks, and those who identify other barriers to the ballot box. We're working with legislators, with local election officials, and the Department of Elections to make these reform recommendations a reality. So today we want to equip you with the knowledge and skills to advocate for voting rights while speaking with your legislators. I love this slide because it just kind of shows you the vast network that we've created of coalition partners. These are just the folks who have agreed to have their logo as a part of our coalition membership. We have a lot of organizations who participate in our bi-weekly meetings and show up and contribute, but for whatever limitations are not necessarily members of the coalition. But as you can see, we have a wide-ranging group of organizational members who spread from throughout the state of Delaware. All 3 counties are represented and lots of different other demographic groups. So really proud of what we've grown. I have a short video. It's about 7 minutes long. We received a grant from our national office to help promote the Delaware Voting Rights Coalition. So I'd like to go ahead and share this video with you. It kind of covers some of the themes we'll be talking about tonight, but has a great soundtrack to it as well. So I'll go ahead and push play. I think you should be able to hear the sound, but if there's an issue, somebody let me know. Uh-oh. Go back to that.
The Delaware Voting Rights Coalition began in 2021. The Delaware Voting Rights Coalition began in 2021 to protect and expand access to the ballot for all eligible Delawareans. We are Delaware's first statewide coalition of organizations and advocates working together to fuel voting rights across the state. We empower communities, especially communities of color, people who speak English as a second language, people who have been involved in the justice system, and young people to identify and remedy barriers to the ballot box.
And I'd like to be able to tell you that I've always voted, but it's not true. I haven't always voted. I have an enlarged heart. My wife has some immune system compromises, and we really welcome the opportunity, the ability to vote by mail. So that's what we did. It took a little maneuvering to allow voting by mail for people as a result of the pandemic, but it happened. And in that time, I started thinking to myself, why is it that we had to make an exception? Why is it that we simply couldn't vote by mail all the time? Because voting is something that matters. If you don't vote, then you're not going to have a say in the future of the country. And there are people in this country who are actively trying to make it more difficult to vote. We have to counter that by making it easier. No excuse absentee voting is a form of voting that allows people to ask for and submit a ballot and submit it without any excuses needed. Well, Delaware state constitution only recognizes 6 particular reasons why you can vote absentee. And if your reason for voting absentee doesn't fall into one of those 6, you can, in the worst case, be disenfranchised, and that's not a good thing. The reason why somebody might need to vote absentee is endless. You could be a single parent with toddler children, you have elder care, you can have job responsibilities that interfere. There should be no reason why anybody can't vote remotely. Delaware's been doing absentee voting for almost 80 years. It works, it's safe and secure. All voters should be able to vote absentee without any excuse at all.
When I decided voting was not enough, I didn't know exactly how I wanted to get involved. So I got active with voter registration and voter education efforts during the 2020 election. I decided to study the Department of Elections website, and I attended Board of Election meetings. These meetings were conference calls due to the COVID pandemic, so they were easy to join. From these meetings, I learned about ivote.de.gov, the website designed to provide Delawareans with everything they need to know about voting, and I had never heard of it before. At ivote.de.gov, you can register to vote. You can edit or cancel your registration. You can find your polling place and the times that it is open. You can request an absentee ballot and track it once it is received by the Department of Elections and make sure it has been accepted. You can see who your local representatives are and your voting history in the state of Delaware. With a permanent universal vote-by-mail option, registered voters could request a mail ballot before the election and return it by mail or at a designated drop-off location. Vote by mail would be an additional method Delawareans could use to vote, not the only one. One thing at the core of our democracy is choice. We should have an option in how we get to exercise our democratic right to vote. "34 other states have a permanent universal vote-by-mail option. Me, an informed voter who wants to research a candidate's position on the issues from the comfort of my home. Parents who don't want to pack up the kids in the car and bring them to the polls. A voter without transportation. A voter who works and can't get to a polling place. Any of these and many others would benefit from a vote by mail option.
Hello, my name is Nia Naylor. I'm a sophomore, political science major, secondary education, and legal communications double minor at Howard University, and I'm from Newcastle, Delaware. In the 2020 election, me and both of my parents stood outside of the William Penn High School for about 2 to 3 hours just waiting to get inside the building to vote for approximately 2 to 3 minutes. I have a lot of older relatives and relatives who have different health issues, and they simply would not be able to go through something like that just to vote. No matter how important voting is to them, their health is much more important. Same-day voter registration is one of the most important things our General Assembly can do to increase voter turnout. Estimates predict that we could increase voter turnout by 22,000 people. As a busy college student, if I could take one day that I dedicate to Delaware politics, I'll be able to research the candidates, register, and then vote all in the same time. Same-day voter registration increases voter turnout among those who face the most barriers to voting, like communities of color, low-income communities, and people who travel a lot, particularly young voters like me. As a student at an HBCU, which is a historically black college or university, we face 2 out of the 3 barriers, meaning we are both people of color and we are far away from home. It is ideal that we're able to vote by mail or expand the voting ballot. Delaware's current registration deadline is a problem because it cuts off very early before election season starts, which is the prime time for most people to actually get involved in election season and look into the issues. If you're a busy person, whether you're dealing with mental health issues, physical health, maybe you have children, work, or school, the deadline is not always going to be on your mind. No vote should be missed because someone accidentally missed an arbitrary deadline.
Voting is the bedrock of our democracy.
We may not like all the candidates in our election,
And we may disagree with the choices that other Delawareans may make when they vote.
but we can all agree
That every vote should count.
And that every election should be safe, simple, and secure.
Every issue that you care about,
Every issue that I care about.
and every issue that affects our daily lives is impacted by one simple action:
A
a vote.
vote. As the Delaware Voting Rights Coalition,
we stand ready to protect and expand access to voting.
Because our communities deserve a democracy that works for all of us.
learn more and join us at ACLU-DE.org/DVRC.
All right, so that is our brand new video. Kind of covers all of the main legislative priorities of the Delaware Voting Rights Coalition and who we are. I can share that link in the chat later on so that you can share it with your networks as well. So now I'm going to spend some time talking about HB 75. You've probably heard of HB 75. It is the constitutional amendment regarding absentee voting. HB 75 would permit no excuse absentee voting. The bill allows for changes in the current laws that govern absentee voting. It's the second leg of a constitutional amendment that would eliminate from the Delaware Constitution the limitations as to who is eligible to vote by absentee ballot. In Delaware, to pass a constitutional amendment, you need a supermajority in each chamber in 2 consecutive sessions. So the first leg of HB 75 was named HB 73. It passed in 2020. HB 75 is the second leg that is necessary to pass in both chambers by a supermajority in order for this constitutional amendment to be enacted. So it provides that the General Assembly shall enact general laws providing the circumstances, rules, and procedures for absentee voting, and it paves the way for no excuse absentee voting. Right now, there are just a few very explicit reasons in our state constitution that allow absentee voting to occur right now. We're one of a few rare states that actually has this limited to who is eligible to vote with an absentee ballot. And even more rare is it to be enshrined in a state constitution. I have the language of HB 75 there on the screen for you. It would amend the Constitution, Article 5, Section 4A. It says the General Assembly shall enact general laws providing the circumstances, rules, and procedures by which registered voters may vote by absentee ballot. This language really tracks what's already in our Constitution in Article 5, Section 1. That article provides, that section provides that the General Assembly shall provide the means and methods of voting throughout the state. And so it really just gives that power right back to the General Assembly to kind of determine who's eligible to vote with an absentee ballot. Interestingly enough, it's Section 4A, because the Constitution was amended in direct response to a Supreme Court decision in the early 1940s, where the Supreme Court said that there was no provision for absentee voting in the state, and it overturned a Military Voting Rights Act that the General Assembly had passed. The General Assembly, in response to the Supreme Court decision, said, oh no, we want to make sure that our service members are allowed to vote, and passed the constitutional amendment back in the early 1940s. Since then, it's been amended a few times to expand that access to absentee balloting to include folks with disabilities, folks who are on business, folks who are on vacation, and folks who may not be able to vote because of religious reasons. Oh, here we go. Who's currently eligible as absentee voters? Qualified registered voters who shall be unable to appear to cast their ballot at any primary, school board, or general election at the regular polling place of the election district in which they're registered, either because they're in public service to the United States, because the nature of their business or occupation, or eligible incarcerated people because of sickness or physical disability, because of absence from the district while on vacation, because of the tenets of their religion, or because they're temporarily residing outside of the US, or because they're a spouse or dependent thereof. What you'll note is that public health restrictions or fears of a pandemic are not included as a qualifying reason. So back in 2020, when we had the rise of COVID-19, there was no provision within our state constitution to permit folks to cast an absentee ballot. And so what had to happen instead is the General Assembly passed emergency legislation allowing all voters to vote by mail in the 2020 elections. But it was COVID-19, unless you were actively ill with COVID-19, it was not one of the reasons that a person could actually qualify to cast an absentee ballot. So that's just one example of why these limitations are really too narrow, and we ought to have a no excuse absentee balloting system like 34 other states currently have. No excuse absentee voting is a form of voting. It allows anyone to request a ballot and submit the absentee ballot by mail with no excuse needed. Many of you may be familiar with the process because perhaps you cast an absentee ballot in the 2020 election or a vote by mail ballot. It's the same process. You request the ballot comes, you fill it out on your own time at your own convenience, and you return it either at a drop box or a mail location. Our Constitution is one of the most restrictive. 34 other states have permanent no excuse absentee voting or a universal vote by mail program. Importantly, we're not advocating for a universal vote by mail program. That would be where everyone has to cast a ballot by mail or drop box. The state of Delaware actually recently invested in brand new voting machines for people to vote in person on election day. We really think that it ought to be up to the voter, that they ought to decide, you know, if I have election day off or I have extra time on election day, I like taking my kids to participate on election day, so be it, that's fine. But for folks who want to make sure that they exercise their right to vote and want to do it on their own time in the convenience of their own home, vote by mail might be the better option for them. And they shouldn't have to generate an excuse for why they want to use the absentee ballot process. Safe and secure absentee voting has existed for nearly 80 years. As I said, right in the early 1940s is when Delaware first enacted absentee voting for military personnel. So our elections officials know exactly how to do this process. It's not new in Delaware. It's certainly not new in the United States. And so our elections officials know exactly how to keep these ballots safe and secure, whether they're cast in person, by mail, or at early vote locations. Our right to vote outside of the confines of a polling station shouldn't be limited to specific circumstances. People may want to vote absentee to take the time to study. Think about it. A lot of us know a lot of the races at the top of the ticket. Most folks can name the folks who are running for president, but may not know who's running for their city council member position. So you can take the time when you have the ballot in front of you, Google the names, figure out what these people stand for. There might be races on the ballot that you weren't familiar with before Election Day. So it gives you that time to study the issues and study the candidates on the ballot and get those questions answered. It also can decrease the number of people voting in person and decrease the long lines that folks have on Election Day. You heard Nia talk about going with her family on Election Day, and there unfortunately are some polling locations in Delaware where people have to wait for quite a while in line just to cast that ballot, which takes just a few minutes. And so if you have fewer people that have to show up on Election Day because they don't qualify for one of the absentee reasons, then you can decrease the number of folks that are waiting in lines and decrease the wait times on Election Day. And it also allows us to plan for any unexpected threat that emerges, including but not limited to another pandemic or another resurgence or another variant of COVID-19. Again, it's not one of the excuses that is recognized in Delaware's Constitution. So it really opens it up so we don't have to pass emergency last-minute legislation to allow folks to cast their ballot to keep our democracy going. So we need your representative to vote yes on HB 75. Importantly, this is a bipartisan bill. HB 73 passed in the House of the General Assembly in 2019 with broad bipartisan support. All but 3 representatives voted yes for HB 73, the first leg. That first leg had the exact same language as HB 75. Again, has to be passed the exact same way in 2 consecutive sessions. So the first leg passed the House in 2019 and then passed the Senate in 2020. Second leg was introduced last year in 2021. Unfortunately, what we saw was a rise of partisanship, and not a single Republican was able to support the exact same language that they had voted for just 2 years before. So HB 75 was 2 votes short of passing, but could have passed had we had that continued bipartisan support in 2021. Because of some procedural maneuvering, when it came up for a vote in 2021, it's not dead just quite yet. It was moved to the table because of some procedural maneuvering, and so we hope to have HB 75 reintroduced, but first we're going to have to get at least 2 folks who didn't support it last year, but who supported it back in 2019 to come back around and support it again. During the 2020 election, the emergency legislation that passed allowing vote by mail for all Delawareans saw a voter increase of 7%, with 1 out of 3 of the votes cast by an absentee or mail-in vote. So we see that when we increase options for Delawareans to cast their ballot, increase in voter participation. That probably sounds logical to you all, that when you increase the options to vote, more folks vote. And so that's one of the real reasons that we are really supportive of increasing the opportunity for folks to cast a no excuse absentee ballot. These were the 4 representatives that we targeted in our advocacy day. All 4 of them voted for this exact same language in 2019. None of them voted for it when it came up for a vote the second time in 2021. But interestingly, as I said, this is a bipartisan issue. Each of these representatives actually received a fair number of absentee votes themselves. I have the number of absentee votes that each of these representatives received in the 2020 elections. And interestingly, Representative Smith received more absentee votes than his opponent. So I'm going to pivot a little bit. I've talked about absentee voting. This is the process where, unless it's no excuse absentee voting, it's because you are absent from the election district. A broader method of voting is vote by mail. So I'm going to spend some time talking about what vote by mail is and what the difference is between vote by mail as a method of voting and absentee voting as the type of person who qualifies to vote with an absentee ballot. And I'll also spend some time talking about same-day registration. So vote by mail is where registered voters may request a mail ballot before the election that may be returned either by mail or at a designated drop-off location. Vote by mail is exactly the process that emergency legislation provided for in the 2020 elections. It's important that vote by mail be made available to Delawareans in 2022 because more than 160,000 Delawareans cast a mail ballot in 2020 because of the emergency. So these are going to be folks who've already voted by mail in 2020, and unless our General Assembly acts this year, they will not have the opportunity to cast a mail ballot again in the 2022 elections. That's going to be a crisis of confusion. Folks are going to say, listen, I voted by mail last time, why can't I this time? And the reason is, unless the General Assembly acts, there is no mechanism in place. That emergency legislation that passed in 2020 was only available for the 2020 elections. It had a sunset provision, so it no longer is effective. Importantly, that legislation was challenged. I know I was on vacation last week, but I wasn't completely tuned out of the election news in the state of Delaware. You may have learned that early voting has been challenged by folks in Delaware, saying that the General Assembly doesn't have authority to permit early voting because it might expand those who are outside of their election district's eligibility to cast an absentee ballot. That same argument was actually used in 2020 by the Republican Party. They sued the state to try to stop the emergency legislation from going into effect. They tried to stop the emergency legislation allowing vote by mail in 2020. The court said that because of the pandemic and the broad powers of the General Assembly, that the General Assembly had the emergency power to keep our government going and to have elections so that we could have a formative government be made. So that challenge failed in 2020. We'll see how the courts review the early voting challenge coming around this year. But it's really important that folks understand that without the General Assembly acting this year, unless you have an excuse to cast an absentee ballot, you will not be eligible to vote by mail in the 2022 elections. That's going to really confuse 160,000 Delawareans. Compare that to the folks who voted by an absentee ballot in 2016. That was only 25,000 folks. So there are only, about 25,000 folks who are used to the vote by mail absentee process that they've been a part of for years past. A lot of new folks cast a ballot by mail for the very first time in the 2020 elections. Those folks are going to be confused if they can't do it again. So the difference between absentee and vote by mail is the method of voting. So voting by mail, how you vote, that all Delawareans could choose, right? You can choose to get your ballot by mail, or you can choose to go on election day, or you can choose to early vote, assuming that the court upholds that as an option for us. And it doesn't matter whether you're absent. You could be at home all day long, watching your kids or working or fishing, whatever you want to be doing on election day. You don't have to have that excuse to vote by mail. It's just another constitutionally authorized method for you to take the time to vote how you want by mail from the comfort of your home. It's just an additional method to vote. And absentee voting is where you have to have that excuse, unless it's no excuse absentee voting. So HB 75 would allow folks to have no excuse and just say, it doesn't matter why I'm not going to show up on election day. I'm just not going to show up on election day. We call that absentee voting. It determines it absentee because of your presence or lack thereof on election day at your polling location. All right, I'm going to talk a little bit about same-day registration. Same-day registration allows a qualified resident of the state to register to vote and cast their ballot all on the same day, including on election day. Right now, this is HB 25, which is sponsored by Representative Sherry Dorsey Walker. This is really important. As you saw in the video, same-day registration could increase voter participation in Delaware by 22,000 voters. If you think about it, right now, a person who's just moved to Delaware has to remember not only when election day is, but they also have to remember an arbitrary deadline of the fourth Saturday before election day is the last time that they can register to vote in order to exercise their right to vote and participate in those elections. It's a really arbitrary deadline, and there are 21 other states plus the District of Columbia that have same-day registration. The point is that you bring in the same registration materials that you would bring to the DMV if you were to register to vote there, and you show them to the election officials on election day. You say, listen, my name is Dwayne Bensing. I live at 1223 Tatnall. Here's my driver's license. Here's my utility bill, whatever you need to show, the same identification that you need to show to register to vote by mail, you would show in person. They would register you right then, right there. We know, right? We have technology. We have amazing capability and capacity to keep our voter rolls secure and updated. You could immediately register that person to vote and provide them with a ballot right then and there. It becomes a one-stop shop. Why should voting be 2 days in the same cycle with 2 different arbitrary deadlines? We live busy, busy lives. This is just an added barrier to the ballot box that decreases participation. States that allow same-day registration experience on average a 5% increase in voter participation and consistently have the highest participation in the country. Like I said, in 2022, 21 states and District of Columbia allowed it. So this isn't some rare hippy-dippy kind of thing. This is something that a lot of states have used to allow folks access to the ballot box. HB 25 is the current legislation pending. It has not yet had a committee hearing. It provides for registration through and including election day for the presidential primary, special election, and general elections, whereas currently that deadline is the 4th Saturday prior to the date of the election. So hard to keep up with that arbitrary date. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and stop my share there. I know that I've gone a little bit under time, but last time I have talked about these issues, there have been lots of questions. And like I said, I know there's a lot of news in the last week that you all may have some questions about as well. So I'm happy to talk about that. I will flag, I've raised these as our 3 legislative priorities. These aren't the only issues that we've been working on. As you know, last year was a redistricting year in Delaware, so we worked on a lot of identifying communities of interest and public comment on the redistricting process. That has ended for the state. Sussex County is in the middle of their redistricting right now. Newcastle County was one of the first to get through with that, but we were advocating on that issue as well. We also work heavily on folks in the reentry community. In 2016, Delaware passed legislation allowing folks who are on probation for fines and fees to be eligible to vote. So essentially the idea there was you shouldn't be disenfranchised because you owe a court fine or fee. You should still be able to vote if all that's left of your probation sentence is a fine or fee. That passed in 2016. What we recently learned, however, is that the Department of Corrections database of tracking people on probation didn't distinguish whether they were on probation because of a fine and fee or whether they were still on custodial probation. So we've identified that issue for them. They have identified over 1,000 folks in the last year who've registered to vote and have been deemed ineligible, and we don't know how many of those were improperly labeled as ineligible. So they're going through that to try to fix that issue. But that's one of the many issues that we're trying to work with the Department of Corrections and Department of Elections to help make sure that folks who are re-entering society after they've served their prison term are eligible. Those who are eligible are able to get registered to vote and exercise their right to vote. There are probably other issues that I'm not thinking of right now, but those are the main highlights, and I'd love to just answer any questions that you may have. Go ahead, Roger.
You noted that some representatives and senators in the state voted for it in one cycle, and then the same thing they voted against. What were their reasons for their change in attitude? I'm sure that they've had to defend their positions. I'm just interested in what they have said.
Sure. That's always the first question that folks ask me, and I always encourage folks, talk to these representatives, because I think it changes and shifts a little bit each time we talk to them. You may recall that in the 2020 election, there was a cloud of doubt cast on mail ballots by one of the presidential candidates. And that extreme partisanship and big lie narrative has unfortunately filtered down into our state and local politicians' views. So some of these folks I've heard are now fearful of fraud, even though there has been little to no evidence of voter fraud in Delaware, not in 2020 or previously. There's challenges of the voting rolls. There have been a lot of rumors about deceased people casting ballots, but no evidence that that has occurred. And so I place most of what I've heard has just really been a regurgitation of these really harmful anti-democratic talking points that were very partisan on the national level coming home right here to Delaware. All four of the representatives we talked to on our advocacy day said that they supported no excuse absentee voting or universal vote by mail. They just didn't like the way that HB 75 accomplishes that goal. One of the concerns that's not logical to me is that the giving the power to the General Assembly to determine how folks will cast an absentee ballot, they didn't like that because they said, well, that's going to empower whoever has the majority to decide who gets to vote with an absentee ballot. Obviously, there are other constitutional safeguards to make sure that our General Assembly doesn't deny the vote based on unsound reason, right? You can't deny the vote based on race or sex or disability or things like that. You have to provide opportunities for folks with disabilities to exercise their right to vote just constitutionally. So I don't really understand this idea that for absentee voting, they want super protections and not a majority in the General Assembly, because as I said, Article 5, Section 1 already gives the General Assembly broad authority to determine the methods and means of how elections are conducted in the state of Delaware. But that's another criticism that we heard. So I think fraud is the one that I think is a kind of a red herring, doesn't exist, not really a fair criticism and just a Republican partisan talking point. And then the second would be that they don't want to give a majority the authority, the power to impact any voting methods, but that's already also baked in to our Constitution with appropriate safeguards.
Now, are they concerned about the way that a ballot is confirmed to be from the person that it's supposed to be from? In other words, does Delaware do identity match by signature, by what methods is Delaware using? And is that one of their concerns, that I could submit a ballot for somebody else and fake a signature or just an address, or is that maybe a legitimate concern, even though the amount of fraud I recognize is probably minuscule? Because why? Why take the risk of committing a felony for one vote? It just doesn't make any sense. But I'm just trying to look at their arguments and pick them apart.
Yep. And that's what we have to do. I mean, as I said, they all voted for it in 2019. So it's hard for me to really take with good faith some of the criticisms that we're hearing now. And so I would encourage everyone to think really critically if you hear these issues. So I'll answer the security. Everybody wants our ballots to be safe and secure. I think that's why we wanted an increased number of drop boxes to make sure that we didn't have, people had to travel far to get to drop boxes, that sort of thing. Right now, the way that our voter rolls are updated, the Department of Elections sees immediately when they receive a ballot from a registered voter, that is marked in the system. And so a person would not be eligible to cast a ballot by mail and then show up on election day and cast a second ballot. That's not a thing that the system permits. As far as casting ballots for other people, again, there's no evidence of that. As you already said, that's already a crime. So to the extent that that criminal law works as a deterrent on this issue, I mean, it's hard enough. we had great voter turnout in the 2020 election, was right at 70% or so. It's hard enough to get everyone who's eligible to turn out to vote. I don't see a lot of folks so enthusiastic that they're voting multiple times. That's not something that we're seeing that there's evidence for in the state of Delaware. Not to say that it could not happen, but I think that it's a solution in search of a problem. That's not really a problem that exists in the state of Delaware. The safeguards in place are the voting rolls matching the registration with the cast ballot. A signature is required. However, we do not do signature verification in the state of Delaware. I'll tell you, I think that that's a good thing. I think having the signature requirement, the Department of Elections also does an audit of their elections and the ballots to ensure that they are from the people who cast them, that sort of thing. And so I think that's another safeguard that's already in place. The signature could be used if there was a challenge, say, well, I have a ballot here from Roger, but this doesn't look anything like Roger's signature. That would be really good evidence to discredit a ballot down the line. If there were a challenge that, Roger didn't cast that ballot, Roger's been out of Delaware for years, right? The signature gives you that piece of evidence that you would need. Doing signature verification, however, you might look back, Roger, at some of your letters from 10, 20 years ago. Your signature might be a little bit different. And what we found is that what happens is that the folks who get flagged in signature verification are quite often elderly folks whose signature has changed or mobility has changed, folks with disabilities whose signature just doesn't match after they've maybe had a stroke or something like that. And also people with non-Anglo-Saxon names, so minority folks who have, apostrophes or something like that. Anything that makes the name less familiar to perhaps you and I is more often flagged as, oh, well, this signature doesn't match because it's harder to recognize. And so the signature verification piece is something that comes up a lot, and we have opposed that pretty much universally because it really does disenfranchise a lot of minority groups, elderly and folks with disabilities.
Thank you.
Barbara, I see your hand. Barbara, are you able to unmute? If anybody else has a question while Barbara's unmuting, I can try to cover that. Hi, Sandy.
Hi. I just was going to ask, I love the idea of same-day registration. I just was concerned because we only have one voting day, that if somebody is doing the process of registering and it's already a long line, how does that work logistically? Do they have like a separate line so the people that have to do registration and therefore will be taking more time aren't going to hold up the people that already, are a little stressed for the long wait?
I mean, that's a really great point. And I would take that recommendation to Commissioner Albence for a separate registration line. I think that makes a lot of sense. One of the provisions of the same-day registration allows registration through Election Day. And so I think that it's right now is a better time for same-day registration than perhaps the 2020 election or elections prior, because now we have early voting in Delaware. Well, if it withstands the challenge, and I'm optimistic that it will. And so those 10 days of early voting are also days where folks would be eligible to go register and vote all in the same day. And so not that they would have to, but it also encourages those folks who are waiting, to vote on Election Day. I've been advocating for a long time to get away from the language of Election Day and to call it an election season, because for folks who have a ballot, vote by mail ballot, by absentee ballot, or are eligible to early vote or otherwise cast a ballot before the final day. I think of election day as the deadline to vote. And I get the sentimental attachment to voting on election day, but I always tell people, you never know what's going to happen that morning, right? You could get in a car accident and then not get to the polls, and that would be too bad. So, it's just, I think that folks should plan ahead and get that ballot in while they know they can. So it's a good point. It could slow down on election day. And I think that if we put all of our voting eggs in that single election day basket, that would be a concern that I would be really worried about. I think the update in our voting machines, the extension of early voting period, and the extension of vote by mail eligibility helps deter those long lines on election day, and I'm optimistic that wouldn't be a large deterrent for folks. Again, these 22,000 potential same-day registered folks would be throughout the state of Delaware, so they're not all going to be, in one voting election precinct.
Based on what you said, is there early poll voting in Delaware? I know.
No, the early voting period is at, right now it's at one location in each county, and I think Wilmington has an additional. So I think there are 4 early voting locations in the state of Delaware. The Department of Elections could increase that number. In fact, we've encouraged them to do so. But right now there are 4 early voting locations.
And you said that's for 10 days?
It's 10 days, including the weekend before the election day.
Okay, so I wasn't aware of that, and I thought I was pretty well informed. So
well, it's brand new. This is the first year.
Okay.
This is the first year. So
there's been an election already using early voting. It was a primary for the seat abandoned by Brady or something.
Right. It's right now. Early voting is happening right now in Representative District 4, the seat that was vacated by Representative Brady. Election day, the deadline to vote, is this Saturday. So people are voting right now at the early vote location. But this is the first election in the state of Delaware in history where people have been able to early vote without an excuse. And so before, if you were an absentee voter, you could show up to the Department of Elections early to get that mail ballot and cast it at the Department of Elections. So some people pushed back with me, oh, Delaware's had early voting before. Well, that's not what I'm not talking about absentee voting early. I'm talking about anybody showing up those 10 days prior. So this is the very first election. I will put an asterisk. I don't think early voting applies to school board elections. So one of the next elections that many of you might be participating in are the school board elections in May. I don't believe early voting applies to those because those are under a separate section of the Delaware Code that has school board elections explicitly provided for. So early voting only applies to general special elections that are in the general election code, the elections code of the state law.
okay, thank you.
Yeah, tell all your friends about early voting. I'm so excited. I've been an early voter since I was a freshman in college, so I love early voting. I was a voter in Arkansas when I started voting, and we had it there. So I was surprised when I moved to Delaware and y'all didn't have it yet. I was like, what's going on? And they said 2022. I said, all right, let's do it then.
Dwayne, what was the what was the legislation that created early voting? And when was that passed? I'm with Sandy. I had no idea that early voting was a possibility.
1 second, I might have it in front of me. It kind of went in under the wire. And I actually think that oddly enough, I think Representative Brady, it may have been Brady and Bentz, were the authors of early voting legislation. Let me see if I can find, I have too many tabs here. I don't have it right in front of me, but I'll follow up with you all to make sure that I can get that early voting legislation. New legislation that did pass this last session was automatic voter registration. Some people confuse automatic voter registration with same-day registration. Automatic voter registration is when you go to the DMV or another state agency, and when you provide a state agency with your information, you're automatically placed on the voter rolls, and then are provided, the states will send a postcard to you saying you've been registered to vote. You can opt out. at that point. Right now, you can opt in at the state DMV when you get your driver's license. You can say, I'd like to register to vote. The automatic voter registration says, all right, you've shown up, you're a voter unless you choose not to be a voter. That has been passed, but not yet enacted. They wanted to give the Department of Elections time to implement that legislation. So I think the soonest we'll see automatic voter registration in place, I think that'll be 2023 is when that law will actually start being rolled out. And it starts with the DMV agencies, but then will roll out at other state agencies.
And when that is fully in place, if you go to any of those agencies and change your address or change anything else, then it feeds into the voter rolls, right? So that you don't have to make a separate step to update the voter rolls.
Exactly. And so for folks who are concerned about keeping our voter rolls up to date, that a lot of folks had concerns about the number of mail applications, ballot applications that got sent and returned to the Department of Elections. There was a certain percentage of mail ballot applications mailed out that got returned because of wrong address. And people thought that that was evidence that our voter rolls were really, mistaken. And so for folks who are concerned about keeping our voter rolls up to date, automatic voter registration is a great tool to make sure that we're updating continuously people's voter registration information so that, when you do move, you might be thinking, oh, I got to get a new driver's license. But if the election is 2 years away, you might not be thinking about updating your voter registration. And so it just helps update those voter registration rolls automatically so that when you are showing up at your election precinct to say, oh, no, I don't live there anymore, you haven't missed your registration deadline, hopefully, if there's same day registration, and you've already been automatically updated because of automatic registration.
And so tell me again, when does automatic voter registration go into effect?
They have until, I have to look this up every time. It is, oh, I'm looking at the wrong one. 2 years after enactment. And so enactment was, oh my goodness, when was it signed by the governor? Signed 6/30/21. So it'll be 6/30/23. Or the election commissioner could certify that they're ready beforehand. I've not heard any news that Commissioner Albans, I think his hands have been pretty full, so I haven't heard that he's pushing it before then. So at the latest, it'll be 6/30/23.
And he came and spoke to our Thursday night group within the last couple of years, I think. Yeah, we had him come and talk about voting rights and voting legislation in Delaware, but before some of this was passed, I think. Thank you.
He's super accessible, and I encourage folks if they have questions. I mean, I've found that the Department of Elections always answers whenever I've reached out to them for questions. So
he was tremendously responsive. We had a number of questions after the last session, and he was responding. It was kind of humiliating how fast he was responding. I feel so.
I don't think he's asleep.
I don't think so.
I'm like, it's 10 o'clock at night. What are you
Absolutely.
doing?
I've had those emails from him too.
Thank you.
Yeah, go ahead.
One question again. So the differences between vote by mail and no absentee or no excuse absentee voting are really, you get the same ballot, probably in the same time frame. I'm guessing. Is it they would come at the same time? In both situations, you have to request. Your request can be before the date that the ballot's available, so then the ballot would come to you at the same time, whether you do no excuse absentee voting or vote by mail. Is that right? They are meshed in terms of the same timeline all the way.
So yes, I think I kind of had this idea before, because I think the reason why we confuse vote by mail and absentee voting so easily is that the way in which people absentee vote is by mail, right? So the method that we have provided in state law for absentee voters is a mail ballot. But let's go to imaginary world for a minute. There would have been nothing stopping the General Assembly to provide that folks who wanted to vote absentee, who were eligible to vote absentee, did so via telephone, right? They could say, we're going to give absentee voters a pin. They're going to call the Department of Elections and they will cast their vote by voice on a telephone, right? Then we'd have no confusion. We'd be like, oh, absentee voters, they use the phone, and vote by mail, they use mail, right? So the General Assembly could have done it however they wanted, but the way that they did absentee voting is by mail, because we've had mail longer than we've had phone lines, right? But the asterisk here is you don't have to go to an imaginary world. Some voters, military voters, and voters with disabilities are permitted to vote by email in Delaware. We're one of the few states that actually permits email ballots to be cast. And it goes through a secure website. ACLU of Delaware is not yet in a position to support electronic voting. We're concerned about the security of those ballots. But I'm telling you that that is a process that Delaware has adopted for some absentee voters. Not all absentee voters, but some absentee voters are permitted to vote by email. Vote by mail would not have anything to do with that kind of absentee voting.
It seems to me I did vote by email once, somehow.
I voted in the primary actually by email in 2020 because the governor's declaration said that COVID counted as an illness for the presidential primary. That was the extent of the governor's authority, was the presidential primary election. Otherwise, the General Assembly has all the power. That the governor is powerless to determine, any absentee. So by governor declaration, that said COVID-19 counts as an illness, you may mark it. And then that, because illness and military are the two that get to vote by email, I was like, well, let me see what this is all about. It was kind of interesting.
Yeah, it was.
And I recall
Barbara,
in the 2020 election that my husband had requested an absentee ballot and then decided that we were going to go vote in person. And so when we showed up, he had to go to another table and show that he still had the absentee ballot. If he hadn't been able to show it, they would have recorded that he had requested it, and it would have disallowed the absentee ballot if he subsequently returned it. So it was very clear they were only going to let him vote one time, despite how hard he worked to see if he could do it.
Exactly. Well, that's a great story, Sue. I'm glad you shared that, because that's exactly how the process works in Delaware. It's how it's supposed to work in Delaware. And it's actually it's better than some of the alternatives. I did some campaigning in Pennsylvania, and there, if you had requested an absentee ballot but could not bring it on election day, they would not let you vote, which really doesn't make a lot of sense because, like I said, the voter rolls are updated automatically. They can easily do what we do here in Delaware and allow people to cast that ballot. So thank you for sharing that story.
Dwayne, we are reaching our closing point here. Is there one more question that somebody would like to ask before we sign off for this evening?
Is Bobby still there? I know her it says Barbara, but Bobby Hoy, do you want to ask a question?
Other than the 4 legislators that you listed, if one of us happens to live in their district, we have the opportunity to call them and request their support. Is there any other advocacy or approach that we could or should be taking to help move this forward?
That is a great segue and wrap up question. So I really appreciate that. The Delaware Voting Rights Coalition meets bi-weekly on Tuesday evenings from 5 to 6 p.m. All are welcome. You don't have to be a part of an organization or anything. You can come in your individual capacity. Just reach out to me. I'll put my email in the chat, and Dick, please feel free to let folks know my contact information. I'm always happy to answer any questions that folks have. But I encourage folks to get involved with the Delaware Voting Rights Coalition. We have been kind of on the front lines organizing our advocacy. The video that I showed at the beginning of tonight's presentation, we're going to break up into smaller, like 30-second digital ads and place those ads on Facebook and Instagram and other things that kids these days use. And then we have done letters to the editor in a coordinated campaign. We have done patch through calling to our legislators. You know, I have also been working with legislators to encourage them that they have the authority to pass vote by mail in the same way that they passed early voting through the constitutional provision of Article 5, Section 1. We're seeing that play out in Pennsylvania right now in real time, and I think that we'll soon learn in Delaware with the early vote challenge, how the courts will see the General Assembly's authority here in Delaware. But we're 2 votes short, so we're so close yet so far away. Those 4 are the 4 that we think are most likely to reach a compromise. I know that Representative Shoup has talked about his own constitutional amendment that would enshrine the right to no excuse absentee voting, kind of rewording it such that the General Assembly isn't deciding who gets to cast an absentee ballot, and that there's a constitutional right. We don't oppose that. The problem is it does nothing for that 160,000 voters in the 2022 election. So there really is a sense of urgency here. So, you know, share with your networks that this is a crisis of confusion upon us, and that we have to have the General Assembly act now and pull out all of the tools in their toolbox to allow folks to vote by mail in this coming 2022 election. I found the legislation that allows early voting. That's another thing. Share with folks about early voting. It's brand new this year, passed in 2019, but wasn't implemented until just this election season. So I put the governor's press release on HB 38, sponsored by David Bentz, and my email is also in the chat.
Will there be some kind of publicity blitz to make sure everybody knows about that? Because I think that's wonderful and huge.
I agree. I sure hope so. My single question to Commissioner Albence at his budget meeting last fall was their plans to do some voter education. Voter education is also one of the goals of the Delaware Voting Rights Coalition. It's why I'm with you all this evening. And so, you know, we'll be spreading the word as much as we can about early voting. The Department of Elections was allocated I think $250,000 for voter education. I'm hoping that they'll use that to let folks know about early voting, because it is brand new and folks have been voting in this state for a long time, and it's a brand new thing. So we're going to have to do a lot of education.
Dwayne, thank you. Interesting, informative, very helpful, and obviously gives us a way to think of things we can do to be supportive of these important reforms. So thank you for being with us. We appreciate it. And thank you.
I appreciate the invite.
Participating.
And just a note, next week, our program is being facilitated by Dave McBride, and we will have 2 representatives from different aspects of the Innocence Project in Delaware and the National Innocence Project, speaking to us about the work that's being done to help correct miscarriages of justice, giving us information about what is happening and also ways that we can get involved. So share that information with others. Hope to see you next Thursday at 7. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Good night.
Thank you.
Night.
Thank you.